So our purpose here is to look at, you can see the top, colonial themes. The main themes we're going to be looking at is government as well as society. So how did colonial Americans govern themselves? And additionally, what was life like for them? How were their lives run, so to speak? Now, when it comes to government, when it says similar structure, what this means is that no matter where you were within the colonies, because remember, there's the New England colonies, so that's your Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island. There's your middle colonies like New York, Pennsylvania, and then you have your southern colonies. Think Virginia and the Carolinas. No matter where you were, there's a few things that tend to be consistent. Now, only Rhode Island and Connecticut had true self-government as opposed to the rest of them. We can see here in the image, the governor usually was either appointed by the king or by the proprietors who received a charter for the colony. So, like Pennsylvania, William Penn and his family received the charter so they could appoint the governor. Things like that. So it's either the king or the proprietors. The thing with the governor is, you can see here, appointed by the crown, oversaw trade and all of that, could dismiss the assembly. Realistically, though, they did have to balance the interests of whoever appointed them with the citizens that they governed. So they couldn't just completely ignore the assembly. They had to balance these competing interests. So the governor is appointed. The council, depending on the colony, you could have 3 people on the council, you could have 28 people, so it could be pretty large. But often, we can see here, appointed by the governor. And they made up the upper house of the legislature. It's kind of like today's Senate. The Senate is considered the upper house. And they were the courts of the colony. Essentially, a lot of these people are more well-connected, wealthy individuals. Now, there's asterisks by elected assembly. Yes, the assembly is elected, but the people doing the electing were usually land-owning, church-going males. All right, land-owning. You needed property. Usually you needed to be a Christian, a church member, to vote. And their decisions could be vetoed by the royal governor. Now, for the most part, as long as the colonies continue to provide Britain with raw materials to benefit Great Britain, it's more of a hands-off approach. So really, this colonial assembly, elected by the colonists, they can make laws, they can tax and all of that. There's a growing independent spirit amongst these individuals. They're going to be used to self-government. Yes, they consider themselves and think of themselves as British, but there's a different type of identity they assume as time wears on. Now, most colonies sent an envoy, a representative to England to advocate for the interests of their colony. This is known as an agent to England. Keep in mind, these agents cannot vote. They do not have voting powers. They are only allowed to speak to Parliament and listen to the debates and votes. They can't actually vote. Ben Franklin did this for Pennsylvania on 2 separate occasions. So he was the agent for Pennsylvania. Once when the Stamp Act was passed, he was actually in Parliament at the time when the Stamp Act was passed, and he predicted the colonies would resent it. He also was abroad when he heard news of the Boston Massacre and other laws, like the Intolerable Acts were passed. So because the colonies can appoint an agent, but they can't vote, this is where the whole no taxation without representation starts to come into play. Now, a burgess is a representative, and what we see here is an artistic depiction of the Virginia House of Burgesses. There were a number of different communities that made up Virginia by 1619. It wasn't just Jamestown. Those landowning males who could vote each elected representatives to serve. This is representative democracy. In the date 1619, it's a sad bit of irony because if you recall, the other thing that happened in 1619, I guess the other thing of historic importance, is that the Dutch ship with 20 Africans showed up in Jamestown. So, in the exact same year, we have the beginnings of American slavery, we have the beginnings of American representative democracy, both in 1619. And again, GB, Great Britain, they're hands off. They have a policy known as salutary neglect. Just follow the laws, enforce the laws, keep the trade coming, keep benefiting us, Great Britain. That's all they care about. So that's where this independent spirit is going to come from. As time goes on, and these colonists think less of themselves as British, a new type of spirit is going to rise. So, government wise, you can see some similar themes. When it comes to society, remember, it's about the money. And the cartoon definitely paints a great example of the concept of mercantilism. And this is the main economic theory among the developed nations of the time. Now, basically, what we have here is that any nation has the right to shape the economy so it could benefit themselves. So economic activity is designed to solely benefit revenue for the mother country. Now, what we can see here, gold and silver, things that could be mined in the Western Hemisphere, foodstuffs that could be grown there, raw materials that were harvested there, all of that was designed to benefit the mother country. Mercantilism also holds that a nation is justified in building up their military forces so they can strong arm rival nations into giving up or taking their trade routes and holding a monopoly on these routes. Essentially, this means that mercantilism is kind of the belief that all wealth in the world is fixed and just changed hands. So there's a set amount of wealth in the world. If one nation's getting richer, then another nation is getting less rich. All right, there's just a transfer of wealth. So because everything benefits the mother country, the colonies don't benefit from any perceived increase in wealth. Additionally, we see fewer choices for the colonies. Colonies were prohibited from trading with other colonies controlled by rival nations, so British colonies couldn't trade directly with French colonies, and in many instances, they could not finish off goods to trade with other portions of the empire. This is going to lead to widespread resentment because people not only don't like being told what they can't do, they don't like being told how they can or cannot earn a living. So mercantilism, along with this rising self-government identity, is going to lead to an eventual break. Now, when it comes to gender roles, keep in mind that, the roles slightly vary from region to region because there's a lot of geographic and economic diversity, but there is a clear distinction we can draw between married women and single women or widowed women, meaning their husband died. For the most part, if you're married, you're seen as belonging to your husband. All right, wives submit their names and property to them, and you can see here, guardianship of children belongs to the husband. All property becomes the husband's property. By and large, the husbands rule. The husbands are in charge. Whereas if you're single or widowed, these are the only women who are allowed to own property, to file lawsuits in court, own businesses, enter into contracts. Now, realistically, you look at this and you might say, why get married? If it seems like economically it's better to be single or widowed, why get married? There was intense pressure for women to marry in colonial America. The Christian faith, religion, was an enormous portion of society. So definitely by one's 30s, I mean, if you were a woman and single into your 30s, it was viewed as kind of different, wrong in a sense. So yes, single and widowed women did enjoy a fairly high degree of economic freedom, but married, not so much. Now, two very interesting traits of colonial society, I mean, we can see here, reading and the role of professionals. Many Americans did start attending school and learn to read, but they didn't have a lot of leisure time, so they didn't do it very often. Most learned to read by reading the Bible. And for many people, that's all they read. Now, local newspapers, generally speaking, they came about to keep citizens informed. And mostly they republished articles about news that were from the London papers so that the colonials could see what was going on with the mother country. However, some began to print local stories and different aphorisms, different humorous tales that would amuse its local readers. Some publishers and printers, like an individual based out of Philadelphia named Benjamin Franklin, became quite famous for this. So Americans, by and large, it's not as if everyone can read, but the literacy rate does rise. With this notion of professionals being mostly on the job, if you want a profession, we think of this idea of, you go to school, you apprentice, you gain experience. Many lawyers and doctors had a brief apprenticeship if they were lucky, or they read law books or medical textbooks. If you're in England, you have professionals who have gone through years of schooling and rigorous training. We just don't have those schools in colonial America at this time. I mean, sometimes in the colonies, a city or town would luck out and you get someone from England who's trained, but this is somewhat rare. For the most part, you learn on the job, and if you were bad at your craft, business would dry up, you'd do something else. But this idea of let me figure some things out, let me practice it, let me become proficient on my own, it really contributes to this individual can-do attitude that we have as Americans.